talk about what the Taiwanese people are doing to defend their homeland and their freedoms, and perhaps what more they might do and why it's important for Americans. We have in the FDD studio today retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, who served as Director of Operations at U.S. Pacific Command and now serves as Senior Director of FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, and Craig Singleton, who served in a series of sensitive national security roles with the U.S. government, primarily focusing on East Asia, and who now serves as a Senior Fellow at FDD and Director of FDD's China program. They led FDD's mission to Taiwan. I went along for the ride. I'm Cliff May, and I'm glad you're along for this conversation here on Foreign Policy. Well, good to see you. You look like you've recovered from jet lag. Thanks for coming in. Most people listening to FDD's podcast probably know something about Taiwan, maybe not as much as they should. I'm going to begin. Taiwan is a free and open society. It's north of the Philippines and south of Japan. Its population is about 24 million, which is just a little bit smaller than that of Australia. It's become prosperous with no help from UN development agencies. Not that I'm aware that those agencies have succeeded in helping any nations on which they spend funds from American and other donors. Beyond being prosperous, it's economically important, usually to the U.S. You want to say a few words about that,
Sure.
Craig?
No, sure. It's great to be here. I think the biggest threat that Taiwan poses to the Chinese Communist Party, right, is that it shows in the real world setting that people of Chinese heritage can embrace democracy, that the democracy can thrive just a few nautical miles off the coast of China. And that is the biggest threat to Xi Jinping as the country sort of encounters just tremendous economic headwinds. And so I think as we think about Taiwan as a vibrant democracy and we think about the threat that they face, it's truly ideological. And the Chinese Communist Party is willing to use every sort of arrow in its toolkit to go after them. The United States has long had strong ties to the Taiwanese government, regardless of which party is in power. And quite frankly, I think we can do a lot more to help them defend themselves and sort of reestablish some deterrence in the Taiwan Strait.
And let me I'm not going to disagree with you, but I'm going to add this, that yes, Xi Jinping doesn't want a free, democratic, prosperous Taiwan, just as Vladimir Putin doesn't want a free, democratic Ukraine, just as the Islamic Republic of Iran doesn't want a free Israel with the Jewish people exercising self-determination. But I do think they all have in all these cases, it's not just the threat of this, they are also ambitious, and they are all empire builders. Let me ask you for a word before you sip your Coke.
So, look, I feel that Taiwan is one of the three beleaguered democracies that we take a look at here. Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel are three countries under significant duress. Taiwan's is unusual. Last year, Craig and I accompanied three retired IDF generals or senior officials there. And I think it took a while, I think, for the IDF officers to realize that it's a different threat. Iran is a tough threat. Being surrounded, having 5 or 6, 7 fronts going at once is a tough threat. Israel has a tough problem. Taiwan has a different problem. They have one threat. It's geographically located right, 80 miles away. And it has 20 times the GDP and 20 times the gross domestic, the size of the economy. It has 50 or 70 times the population. And it has it doesn't want to existentially erase them. It wants to absorb them.
Conquer them.
Conquer them.
Subjugate them
to what will eventually be a one country, one system rule. And so it's a different kind of threat, just like Ukraine. I'm not sure I can identify what Vladimir Putin's measure of victory is in Ukraine these days, and just like it's different than Iran. So all three of these, they face different adversaries, but the common thread is these are three democracies who want to practice market-based capitalism, who look to the United States clearly as their champion, And so for Craig and I, this is going to be a constant mission for us to be over there asking how we can make sure the United States government is helping as efficiently and effectively as possible, just like Mark Dubowitz and a bunch of us do in Iran, like you and John Hardy and a few of us do in Ukraine. We ask that same hard, and I think Matt Pottinger I throw him in with Craig and I are asking this question a lot with regard to Taiwan. So different type of threat, but the principle's the same.
You know, there's a fourth country that's endangered, and I'll point that out, and that's South Korea. Also because the Kim dynasty doesn't want a free country because he also wants to build his empire. It is less imminently endangered, South Korea, for a very simple reason. Thousands of American troops have been there since 1953, when the Korean War halted. I won't say ended, because it halted with an armistice, and the result of that, and this is an important point strategically, is that the war never ended. It still goes on. The Kim dynasty now has nuclear weapons and increasingly sophisticated missiles to deliver them. A ceasefire does not always produce peace. Sometimes you need, and this people forget this, not least here, you need the defeat of your enemies and a victory over them if you really want peace. You can't just kick the can down the road for generations without bad consequences. I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so Xi Jinping insists his goal is the reunification of what he calls a renegade province. I would cast doubt that it's really a reunification because, Taiwan was under the rule of the Qing dynasty after being under the rule of the Netherlands under the Dutch. And then in the 17th century, the Qin dynasty, which was Manchu-led and imperialist, they took over. And then from 1895 to 1945, it was a colony of the Empire of Japan. So to call it a reunification strikes me as a little bit, okay. Nonetheless, he wants to do this. Now the question we start with is, as he's thinking about it in the morning while he's having his breakfast, Xi Jinping thinks, how might I accomplish this goal?
So he does. I think the United States government's job is that every morning when he looks in the mirror and he says, is this a day that my forces can reasonably be assumed to defeat a responsive American, Japanese, and Taiwan defense? Our job is to make sure that every morning he says, not today.
Day for Tai Chi instead.
And, our friend, a friend of mine, Admiral Phil Davidson, testified about 3 years ago that, hey, that day when he can look in the mirror and things are maybe break his way is 2027. Phil made a mistake in that he did not put comma, although many things can impact that. And many things have impacted that. I'd say number one is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And yes, how's that help China, Taiwan? That's not what Bridge Colby and Robert O'Brien and Donald Trump and, the rest, a lot of conservative Republicans tell me. And that's because they fail to realize that for 4 consecutive administrations, we were not properly positioning ourselves to fight China. We weren't building the munitions we need. We weren't doing the system we need. And one of the kind of like the underbellies of the Defense Department that was exposed on February 24th, 2022.
February 24th, 2022,
yeah, it was, hey, the United States is doing the minimal amount of munitions possible. And as a result, our defense industrial base, if a factory can build 200, but you send them an order for 25 for 5 straight years, its new number's 25. Right. And we have now, thanks to the supplemental for Ukraine, supplemental for Israel, supplemental for Taiwan, all 3 of those had significant amounts of U.S. defense industrial base reclamation projects in them. People don't quite get that. That not only did that money not go overseas because it was buying U.S. weapons, it also was being used to increase the amount of weapons we can produce every year.
And the amount of skilled workers to produce.
Yeah, the amount of work
factories.
Exactly. Floor space, factories, equipment. So actually, because of the invasion of Ukraine, our long-range anti-ship cruise missiles went from 40 a year to 200 a year. That's our production. That's a 5-fold increase to the proper level, the level we had been recommending for a decade at Indo-Pacific Command, and the government was not achieving. But I can go through Standard Missile 6, AMRAAMs, Patriot missiles, Javelins from Ukraine, Stingers. All these weapons were not being properly produced. So I would just say that was a change. And that alone moved us a year or two to the right on that 2027 scale. But we also made smart things. Brad Bowman and I argued for 2 years to bring back something called to build something called the E-7 Wedgetail, a new AWACS aircraft. And the Air Force shifted its position, I think partially due to us, and is now procuring them. That moves to the right. Taiwan's increases defense spending. We'll talk about that later on. That moved to the right. Japan's increases defense spending. That moved it to the right. Australia's increases defense spending and bought more U.S. weapon systems. That moves it. All these things move it. We're stationing 2 more submarines in Guam than we used to. That was a decision made by the Trump administration, implemented by the Biden administration. All these things move the market to the right. So I think they intersect around 2029 or 2030 right now. Our job is to keep moving it to the right till experts like Craig tell me there's no longer a Chairman Xi problem. So that's the goal here. And we can do this. It just takes incredible persistence, determination. These are things the United States doesn't always have in spades, but like a consistent approach to doing something for years on end, not months on end.
You know who does have a consistent determination to do things years on end and 5-year plans, by the way, are the Chinese, right? So they hear all the amazing things that we're doing at FDD and that we're pushing the Defense Department to increase capability and think creatively and with an entrepreneurial mindset. And I think a lot of the big minds, the big brains in China are saying too little, too late. Like the gap is shrinking. We're going to continue to invest on all fronts, whether it's shipbuilding or missile development or whatever it is. And they see this gap shrinking. And so I think from China's calculus, they are basing their invasion decision based on 3 sort of interlocking factors. One is the intention bit. We've talked about this. Xi Jinping has made clear his intention to reunify. He has made it central in the, quote, China dream, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Taiwan is the last piece of the puzzle to reconstitute what he believes is sort of China's rightful place in the international order in the world. It's the Hong Kong was the second to last piece. Taiwan is the last piece of the puzzle. And then blending with that is capability. So you have intention and capability. The largest ever military modernization since World War II. We're talking about the development of maybe not as advanced as our capabilities, but aircraft carriers and submarines and electronic weapons warfare and cyber capabilities. I mean, they are putting their money where their mouth is. And the third factor that is something I think that, to Mark's point, we can influence the most is opportunity. Do they sense weakness in Washington? Do they perceive that this president or a future president might not come to Taiwan's aid? And is that the moment where they can leverage both their intention and their capability? And particularly in this moment, in this pre-election sort of period of uncertainty, and there's a certain period after a new administration is installed where, you don't even have people in jobs yet. Are these the moments where they say, let's test U.S. resolve? And I think that's sort of why that we're in a pretty dangerous, 10-month stretch.
The one place I'd either clarify or quarrel with you, tell me which it is I don't want to leave the impression that if Xi Jinping managed to swallow Taiwan, that would be the end of his ambitions. He would retire in peace, open a yoga studio, whatever, because I think he would then go on to, at the very least, compromise the independence of the Philippines, of Japan, of Vietnam. He wants to be the hegemon of Asia, but I think we also know, and we know not least from Matt Pottinger, who chairs our Asia program, that he wants to displace the U.S. as the preeminent power on the globe and establish a new world order in which Beijing, the Communist Party of China, the most powerful communist party in history, makes the rules for the world. He's made some success at this already at places like the UN. Okay, just so we don't agree.
No, totally. But he's thinking about alliance busting, right? He knows that America's treaty partnerships with Japan and South Korea and Australia and the Philippines will be severely tested
I think they'll be over.
Obliterated, I would say,
Yeah.
if we allow Taiwan to fall. And I think that impact on America as a Pacific power is hugely transformational in creating this China-centric global
think
order.
of it with China as a beginning hegemon in Asia. Russia breaks NATO power, which it could do after Ukraine. How you invade Lithuania and see if NATO comes to its defense.
Right? Yeah.
Right. And then the Islamic Republic of Iran takes over the Middle East if the U.S. But eventually the U.S. is a has-been power at this point, and China is the main. But there'll be arguments among them over the decades among these empires, as there always are. But for now, they have one common objective, whether communist or Islamist or Russian imperialists, and that's to diminish the United States.
Well, and you just explained why George Soros and the restrainers are wrong, right? Because they argue that we can show this restraint. But if, let's just say, Taiwan's compromised through either a coercion campaign, which we'll talk about from our tabletop in a minute, or an actual military incursion, it doesn't matter which. There's these choices that particularly we'll start with the Southeast Asian countries. They'll buckle first. Xi doesn't have to say or do almost anything. Of their own accord, Indonesia, Malaysia, even Singapore, they'll begin to
New Zealand, I think.
New Zealand.
Craig.
So they will have to choose. You don't get to choose one economic partner choice and one security partner choice. Right now, most of those countries, in the end, Malaysia's a little teetering, but the rest choose us. If we can't be their security partner choice, they're eventually going to have to bend the knee to China. Once Southeast Asia bends the knee to China, Japan and Korea don't actually have a choice in this. If Taiwan's gone, those countries are gone. That is 60% of their foreign direct investment, 70-80% of their trade, the rest being with us in Europe, small amounts. They have to then bend the knee to China. It will break our treaty structures in the Western Pacific and in both Northeast Asia and Northeast Asia because we've lost Southeast Asia. And what that really means, to me, this is the flaw in that kind of restraint thing. It's this weird thing where the far right and far left, Soros and one of the Koch brothers, come together. Wanted to practice this. The problem is that this is something you can talk about, but you can't execute. If you execute this, we don't make money by trading with Canada and Mexico alone, right? That is not enough for us to have the kind of economy, entrepreneurial economy we want, with the turnover we want, with the GDP growth we insist on, for the market growth all of us want in our 401ks. We got to be engaged and involved in the world, and you don't get the luxury of being engaged and involved on economic issues only. Somebody else will worry about security. If you want to be the champion of that economic system and you want it modeled to your desires, then you better be out there ensuring the security supports your economic vision, your economic models, and your economic partners.
Yeah, some people don't get that. The U.S. is the leader of a specific international community, and that is the free nations of the world. If we don't do that, there is nobody else who can or will. And the world is very different in that. Pause for 1 second and explain to people why the Taiwanese wanted FDD to come over and pay them a visit and what we did there. And then we'll get back to all these substantive questions.
So last year we had this great visit, right? Mark Dubowitz went.
Matt Pottinger, who go ahead.
And Matt Pottinger and Mark Dubowitz, our CEO. And then and 3 Israeli generals, Craig and myself. Mm-hmm. It was a good team, and we met with their military national security people. And we shared the result. Craig and I do a lot of wargaming here. Matt's done some. He was writing a book that both Craig and I wrote chapters in. I mean, it was a good visit.
We're gonna have Craig on. I'm gonna have Matt on to talk about the book soon. Okay, yeah.
And then and you better have Craig and I just to backstop those chapters we worked on.
Oh, really?
No, I'm joking. Matt did a great job. But it was a good visit. But when it was over, and honestly, on that one, we were also looking at civil defense.
Yeah.
That's why the Taiwan had reached out to Israel. Hey, talk to Israel is well known for having a very strong civil defense system, very strong missile warning system, for Iron Dome and things.
Reserves ready to call up within hours.
Exactly. So perfect, a great model for them to take a look at. And so anyway, good visit. But at the end of it, one of the issues that was kind of hanging there is the idea of coercion campaigns, disinformation campaigns, things like that. So after the visit, a Taiwan think tank that reached out to us, an independent one, not associated with the government, but definitely has former government people there who'd probably been told, hey, reach out to these guys, reached out to us and said, let's talk about an economic coercion game. And it matched what Craig and I were thinking, which is that I'd say our country does a good job wargaming the most dangerous things. So we wargame the heck out of cross-strait invasions. I personally did in 2022, did about 20 of them. In 2023, did about 15 of them. This year, about 5. So that's about 35 or so over the last 3 years, where there's either a cross-strait invasion or a blockade. And I'm about to start in a big blockade series again with one of the other think tanks here in D.C. this year. So this just keeps going. The problem is, as a planner, as a military planner, both at U.S. European Command and at Indo-Pacific Command, the war game I practiced for kind of in my exercises was the most likely. That is not the one that most dangerous means, oh hell, what happened? The most likely means is it's happening. It's the most likely, it sounds what it is. And to us, that's an economic and cyber coercion campaign, kind of with a little bit of like spice of military events going on, but not a kinetic strike. And to me, look, this is Xi's like dream. His dream is not to take Taiwan with TSMC and shatters. Taiwan Semiconductor.
We'll get back to what that is in a minute.
Yeah,
but, yeah, right.
It was not. He wants to take Taiwan in whole, functioning, and hope that he can deliver to us a fait accompli with you'll continue your secondary and tertiary supply chains with us, back and forth. We'll all continue to work together. It's just new owner, different color mailboxes. We'll be fine. And so we need to plan for that most likely. So that was the genesis of it. Craig and I worked it. We hired someone else who we've had on foreign policy before, Ben Jensen.
And by the way, we have had on foreign policy, talk to him, and people who want to understand how wargaming works should just look up in our archives that particular show, because I'm not going to explain everything about wargaming here or tabletop exercises, but anyhow, go on. But we have a whole discussion of that. Yeah.
And so the three of us then began to work, and then we brought in Elaine Jasinski, who runs our
economic center.
Economic center, and the four of us and our staffs began to work. Our small staffs began to work, with the Taiwan think tank, the Taiwan Academy of Banking and Finance, to build a tabletop exercise that would take us through a series of steps, with people playing Taiwan, mostly Taiwans, people playing America, mostly U.S. experts from FDD, and then with Craig playing the Chinese.
Craig as Xi Jinping.
That's right.
I know my 9-year-old says I'm a dictator, but it was a little bit of a dream to get to play Xi Jinping that day.
So that's the background of it, and look, it's one of those things where fortuitous things. We at the FDD used our existing donor funds to go fund ourselves, fund our portions of it. Taiwan Academy of Banking and Finance generously took care of their portions and some of the travel elements of it, and it just really worked out well.
Right. Yes, it did. One of the things I learned from it, and I think they learned from it, is you went through, you and Craig, and I'm sure with Ben Jensen, so many different contingencies, and essentially said, can you prevent this? If you can't prevent this, can you mitigate the damage? If you can't mitigate the damage, can you recover? And I could almost see these guys thinking, oh my God, we have so much work to do to plan for all these possibilities. Now, another reason we should, and you alluded to it, I want to focus for a moment on it, that Taiwan is disproportionately important to America and to many other nations in the global economy, is because of something called the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. I want you to tell us a little bit about this, because it's it's unique in the world, is it not?
It is. So TSMC produces the majority of the world's
90%.
Semiconductors, but then it's
high end, very
high end, but in logic chips. We got to be careful. There's a whole thing called memory chips for which South Korean companies have a near monopoly. They have about 90% between three different companies. By the way, they too are building new facilities in the United States. A new one was announced last week. So both Samsung and SY, can't remember the full name of it.
Yeah.
Have built new facilities in the United States. $billion facilities are under construction. So on logic chips, TSMC is the vast, vast majority, but very specifically, they are the only producer of very small nanometer, in other words, series of very small billions of, if not trillions of very small nanometer chips on a single microchip wafer. And they build this using technology that is, and by the way, they assemble the fabrication facility. The actual logic that's imprinted on them is done at fabless at different facilities like Intel facilities in the United States.
Right.
We still do a ton of the intellectual property work that goes into that. The equipment they use is built by ASML, a Dutch company, and uses German lenses and to get the speed of the atoms going fast enough to imprint properly. They use there's 50,000 lenses in one machine that's the size of a small house.
Well, it is truly the most complicated thing to manufacture
in the world,
and they have mastered it.
Yeah, and like subatomic level.
Right.
Yeah, they're smaller than a COVID virus kind
right.
of. Yeah.
I mean, it's because decades ago, as they were thinking about how they were going to grow, how they were going to resist Chinese coercion, how they were going to provide for their people, they made, as a country, a concerted decision. We're going to go all in on semiconductors, and we're going to make ourselves central to this supply chain. And they invested in it, and they built out a tech workforce. I think there was a lot of lessons to be learned here in the United States about how you can become a champion in a cutting-edge industry and then sustain it over time such that it is one of the most lucrative companies in the world.
On occasion, a U.S. politician tends to say they stole it from us. He's
not
wrong. In fact, it was offered to Texas Instruments to us. We passed. That Taiwan created the conditions for success. I'm sorry. This is a big win for them, a lost opportunity for us. There's a lot of them, by the way, in the high tech, the hardware side of high tech. In the year 2000, we were 90+% of all startups. We're now like 3%. We've maintained our championship, our significant majority in IT software. But in IT hardware, we've passed. And I will tell you, it is a little bit has to do with greed and impatience. American venture capitalists are by nature a little greedy. That's okay. A little impatient. That's not okay. IT hardware takes 5, 7, 9 years to evidence itself. IT software takes 12, 18, 24 months to evidence itself as a win or a loss. We like those shorter term ones. So we still own 60+% of that market. The Israelis have another 15, 20% that recapitalize in America. So we really have a big super majority of that. But in IT hardware, we've let it go. No one stole this from us. We gave it up.
And I'm going to give a shout out here to a book called Chip Wars by Chris Miller, who's I think a brilliant guy. We should have him on Foreign Policy sometime. And he goes through the history of this. It was a guy named Morris Chang, born in China, but he's an American. He was at Texas Instruments. He got passed over for the top job. And then he had this idea that you just described for doing something very specific. We're not going to design the chips. We're going to fabricate the chips. Others will design them. And people said to him, Morris, you have a lot of great ideas. This ain't one of them. Mm-hmm. And he went to the Taiwanese and they said, they got it. We'll help you get this done. And what they have in terms of the workforce, in terms of the systems is, I say, unique or close to unique. Now, but that also raises this. If you are Xi Jinping, you must think, and you talked about this a bit, I want to take this over and own this. I don't, if missiles rain down on this plant and their workers are killed, I get a Taiwan that's making a lot of, producing a lot of pineapples. That's not quite as, and they're good pineapples.
They are good.
But that's not quite what I want here. And that gets back to what you were saying is people think of, and listen, if you're the Taiwanese, you look at the 4 endangered nations and you see that 2 of them are at war right now. It's scary. But besides an amphibious invasion, which you can talk about is not so easy, and paratroopers on the island and all that sort of stuff, there are these other less kinetic, more subtle ways of doing it. And I guess I would ask then, from the tabletop exercises, war games, whatever you want to call it, what did you learn about Taiwan's financial resilience, its cyber resilience, that sort of thing?
So it was great that Ben organized this as a two-step game, because if you'd asked me before the game, can China just bring Taiwan to its knees with a financial coercion campaign, I'd have said, yep, no problem. And I think what I learned in it is not so clearly. Look, I think because of the Taiwan banking and financial services system observed Hong Kong 4 years ago, they said, we need to get out of this leverage position, this bad leverage position we have with Shanghai and other Chinese markets. We need to de-risk ourselves a little bit from this. So they've been working pretty aggressively to create a more resilient financial system. That doesn't mean they're there, but I think it would. I think Ben used 14. He gave Craig 14 different options for how to apply pressure and financial. They were very innovative, but some of them were ones we do on a daily basis as America, to, let's say, Russia right now, or to Iran. But many of them were unique ones based on Taiwan and China's interlaced economy. The biggest corporation in China, Foxconn, is a Taiwan-based corporation. There are ways to limit remittances and things that can hurt Taiwan. But still, I found their financial resilience okay. What was not okay was the minute you layer on a little bit of cyber and critical infrastructure attacks, now, you can't. That puts the leverage that China has in financial in a new position, where if you're already weakened domestically, so to speak, inside Taiwan. And let's be clear, we've spoken about this before in a foreign policy. There was a Chinese cyber campaign called Volt Typhoon that basically installed malicious software, kind of malware payloads in our electrical power grids, our water systems, our financial service systems, our banks, our ports, our aviation, our rail, all our critical infrastructures. And look, historically, China was about intellectual property theft. That's not what this was. This wasn't about ransomware. This was about having a position from which to impose either destruction or disruption of our critical infrastructure during a crisis or war. And we're finding these things, and we've announced that we found them in those infrastructure sectors. I promise they're in all of them. And then we found them in Guam and Hawaii and the West Coast. China has a map. They know where the Midwest and East Coast are. They're there as well. And look, if they can tattoo us with all that stuff, they can face paint Taiwan. All of Taiwan's infrastructure has this malware, has these payloads. So we gave Craig 13 of those types of pressure points. And as he began to apply them, now you have a real problem. Now the resilience, the electrical power system, the comm system, the communication system, water systems, particularly the vulnerable, the LNG, transshipment systems really become a glaring weakness, as it would be in the United States for Taiwan. When you combine that with the financial services, now you have this significant pressure on Taiwan. And here's what's weird about it. Craig did it in a way he used, in fact, it kind of surprised the Taiwans. He used plausible. He didn't use the harshest forms of financial coercion. These are ones he could plausibly deny. This isn't about an overall attack. And he was careful with the possible exception of cutting cables, which after a while, how many anchors can you drop on submarine cables, to cut off the fiber optic networks? But, we'll just say he got away with that as well. Those were plausibly not us. Now, what's this do? It prevents the United States from getting enraged. Taiwan's being brought to its knees financially and critical infrastructure-wise by this combined campaign. And the United States is kind of like, well, you really haven't tripped a red line for us.
Well, that was my goal, was to keep America on the sidelines, right? And it wasn't just engaging.
As long as possible.
Expand about that, because there is something called the Taiwan Relations Act. What is the U.S. obligated to do vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Sure.
And by the way, Biden has 4 times said, I'm going to defend Taiwan?
Sure, he has said that. I mean, the Taiwan Relations Act, the basis is that the United States will provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself from coercion. And so,
which we're supposedly doing with the Ukrainians and the and Israel.
Sure,
but the Taiwanese, they can't defend themselves without more American help than we're probably giving to you.
Sure. I think one of the biggest problems they face is that they have placed for over a decade all the right orders for all the right military equipment that we've told them time and time again, you need these things to defend yourself. And unfortunately, as we face competing crises in Ukraine, in the Middle East, all over, the bad guys get a say, right? We've been incapable of meeting those order requests.
We can't deliver them in a timely fashion.
And so on the one hand, we say, do more about your defense and protect yourself and become a porcupine and resist Chinese coercion. At the same time, they look at us and they say, but we gave you billions of dollars and we've placed orders for these things for years. Like, can we just get the things that we're owed? And our bureaucracy and our military industrial base have really let them down. I think on the Chinese side, what's so important about, as we're talking about taking out electrical grids and maybe naval quarantine is I wasn't doing these things just to do them, right? Mm-hmm. My goal was to apply pressure from a lot of different angles. I wanted to wear them down psychologically and economically. And the goal, right, was to achieve a political outcome, right? I wanted them to capitulate to my demands.
Right.
So I'm not just waging war for the sake of war. I think of more like a boa constrictor going around its prey. And my goal was, by the time they realize that I'm squeezing and I'm squeezed so hard, they actually can't get out of my grip. And I could dial my pressure up and I could dial my pressure down. And to Mark's point, sometimes it was clearly me. So if I were to put a trade restriction or sanction a Taiwanese company, it's obviously Beijing directed that effort. But if Chinese fishing vessels cut over a submarine cable, a deep sea cable of, there are 14 of them connected to Taiwan. Oops, maybe not me. Or can I launch cyber or attack your banks? And because I was approaching it through an established capability I already have, I could get away with it. Meanwhile, I think one of the key takeaways we had was Taiwan will have to invest probably billions of dollars to defend itself better in developing the workforce and the capabilities and the resiliency. But for me, China, these are really low cost.
The cost curve,
favors me,
favors China,
the adversary.
Yes.
Well, you also would like Xi Jinping to think the U.S. seems to have a commitment to Taiwan. I don't want to take on the U.S., but the fact of the matter is China, I believe, now has a larger Navy and a larger Air Force than does the U.S., and theirs are growing, ours are shrinking. I saw on Monday, which is today actually as we're recording this, the U.S. Navy's warship production is in its worst state in 25 years, the Associated Press reported. That would give, if I'm Xi Jinping, I would say, well, that encourages me.
Well, the gap is shrinking, right?
Brad Bowman, who you mentioned, who heads our military center, he always makes the case, you don't want your enemies to think it will ever be a fair fight if they take you on. You always want to have overwhelming power over your adversaries. If it's a 50-50 chance, they may throw the dice.
No, I think that's fair. Look, I will say still, I don't want to jump ball today. I don't want a war to start today. But I think if it did, and the United States committed its forces timely, that was the big if. Are we credibly there? But if we were credibly there, I think we'd still win this fight, because a lot of this, what we're seeing is that it's the China 2 to 3 years from now as it starts to come together. When you've had, their aircraft carriers right now would just be targets. There's 3 of them; they'd be sunk almost immediately.
Imagine the public reaction if an aircraft carrier was sunk, right?
But I'm talking about the 3 Chinese ones.
Oh, the Chinese ones.
The 3 Chinese ones would be sunk very quickly. They're just things. I just want to be careful that I think we reached that point. And look, our Navy and our Air Force need to be stronger for the fight we're going to be in tomorrow or 2030. The fight for tomorrow, though, I feel like we could muddle our way through it. 2030, I'm starting to wonder, are we making enough investments to maintain that delta with their forces, as we know they're making investments and we can't compare. I know Senator Sullivan tries to compare their defense budgets and show that they're spending. It's not worthwhile. They're paying a labor rate that's 1/4 our labor rate at shipyards, at aircraft construction facilities. So at some point, $20 billion in fighter plane production goes a lot farther. It goes about 4 times farther in China than it does in the United States. So they are spending enough to surpass us if we do not continue to invest, to develop, and take advantage of the one thing we do have, which is a lot of ingenuity. The coolest stuff on the battlefield, either U.S. or Chinese, was invented in the United States. If they have cool stuff, it's because they stole it from us. So, from that perspective, I feel like, and where they haven't been able to steal stuff like submarine quieting, things like that, we still maintain a pretty significant advantage. But I would just say generally, we need to keep these investments up to maintain that delta so that Xi doesn't make that decision to go. But that, circling back on this war game, what Craig was creating, what the Chinese were able to create, was the conditions where Taiwan was losing the will to fight, and the United States was not in a position to intervene. It had not tripped our red lines. We were doing some economic support, sure, but that's minor league in that, compared to the pressure they were feeling. We have not tooled ourselves up. We've tooled ourselves up to impose economic costs on, say, Russia and Iran through sanctions. I don't think we've sat back and thought about how do we use our economic tools to protect a key ally or partner when under pressure. And I don't think you should figure that out in the hour after it starts, right? You should be figuring that out in the months or years beforehand, so that you have the legal reviews, the appropriations, the authorities, whatever it is, the tools at your hand, and that you understand what you expect Japan to do, and Australia to do, and Korea to do, and Europe to a small degree, to contribute to this, as well as Taiwan understanding what they can expect from us.
And this will be my last subject for today, though. If you want to bring anything else up, I'll give you a chance. But just give us an update on Taiwan and what it is doing or not doing in terms of spending. And there's a new defense innovation unit, I understand. Their budget, their reservist program. Just give us a quick overview of whether you are encouraged by that they're getting really serious about this in the way you think they should.
I mean, I think the Taiwanese defense spending numbers have been getting a lot of attention in our political discourse here in the U.S., I think for the wrong reasons. I think it's true that Taiwan is not currently spending enough, but I also would say that every Taiwanese official we met would agree that they need to spend more. The question is how much more, and how are they going to, where are they going to place those bets? Because I think to Mark's point earlier, more for the sake of more doesn't necessarily make for a good deterrent. Are you spending the money wisely on, these sort of cheap asymmetric drone capabilities that would complicate the cross-strait invasion? How are you spending those dollars? And so I do think it's important that we remember that since the Trump administration, and I think in large part because the Trump administration pushed a lot of democracies around the world to spend more, Taiwan's defense spending has increased by an average of 5% a year since the Trump administration. And when you take into account, we here have a chaotic and confusing budget process. I think we can all acknowledge that. Other countries do too. And when you combine all of the different budget line items and special budgets that Taiwan has, they're close to about 2.7% of GDP on defense. We think the number should be about 3%, and that puts them in the same ballpark as South Korea, as Poland. And I think while they're not in the sort of the realm of Israel, I think the likelihood of getting them that high soon is probably unlikely. And also, I'm not sure they could really absorb that amount of money to begin with. But I do think they were very focused on this. They just released an updated defense budget. These are not defense free riders, in other words. They don't expect us to just swoop in and save the day. I think they're taking the threat very seriously. They're putting their money where their mouth is. And there are real opportunities here, not just for the U.S., where we have maybe fallen short in providing the big ticket items that we say they need to defend themselves, but even private industry here in the United States. AI companies and some of the more agile defense contracting firms are in a position to meet the need for these drones and submersible vehicles and the things that we still think could buy the island some time.
So I agree with all that. And, I do think they're in the top 5 or 6 democracies, and they should, aim to be like a bronze medal winner, get up in the top three. The United States about 3.1% to give the listeners an idea.
Not enough, in my opinion, but go ahead.
Israel's about 5.5%, which they found out painfully was not enough.
Not enough. Yeah.
Poland's in the between 3 and 4%, depending whether they buy Patriots and F-16s. It varies quite a bit, and Greece is the other democracy that's up there, and that's really because of Turkey. I'm not 100% sure, how we see that, but bottom line is they're in those top 5, top 6 democracies in the world. Korea's up there with them, and then we want them to get higher, but let's not pretend they're like a freeloader.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah.
A couple other things. We've been talking about munitions. We worked hard on some legislation to push the U.S. to have munitions, Taiwan-specific munitions in place. The Department of Defense interpreted that very liberally to say we'll put some weapons in Guam. This is contralogical. The problem is that if you have a a Ukraine-type situation, there is no Polish border, Slovak border, Romanian border where you can flow all these weapons across. Right. If we have an Israel-type situation, we don't have the air power over the target set, over Israel. That's, Israel controls the air power over Israel. Therefore, U.S. C-17s can land every 2 to 3 days with munitions and push them out the back. If we're in a conflict or a significant crisis with China over Taiwan, we're not going to be able to reload them. So we need to stockpile them ahead of time. Because DOD is being a little bit intransigent, we're pushing back for legislation this year. It's in the NDAA. I hope it gets through. It's called Warsaw T, War Reserve Supplies Allies Taiwan. It's modeled on the War Reserve Supplies Allies Israel and the War Reserve Supply Allies Korea, the two that exist already. It's where we stock a lot of stuff in theater. Now, we can pull it out if we need it. We pulled stuff out of Korea and Israel to give to Ukraine and then replenished it back in. We pulled it out of there for Israel itself in the Israeli case. So we need one for Taiwan. And they have beautiful mountains and caves to put this in, to safely put it in. We can store the stuff there. That's one. And the other big issue is the reservists. We need to get the reservists right. This is what we had the Israelis over there. The Israelis are kind of distracted right now, probably not in a position to give much advice to Taiwan. But, they have 3 million reservists, 2 million reservists, and they train 100,000 a year. That's not enough. You can't get training it's actually about 125,000 every 10 or 12 years. That's like a rod and gun club. It's not a reserves. They need to trim themselves down to 200,000 or 300,000 healthy men and women who want to be in the reserves, who get annual training, whose companies allow them to go for that training, who then get together on a monthly basis to do a little bit of weekend warrior stuff. To do that, they're going to have a lot of gear, good quality gear. They could do what's called Presidential Drawdown Authority. We've approved that money. It's already there where they could draw down from U.S. excess supplies on that, which as we've shrunk our army, we have. And we've pulled out of a lot of warfighting conditions in Iraq and Afghanistan. We actually have that kit. We also and then they're going to have to do something really hard, which is their army, which is kind of dyed-in-the-wool hardline, is going to have to acknowledge that this is a major mission for them and take a couple of their infantry fighting brigades and turn them into reserve training brigades. But if you sacrifice 2 brigades that way of active duty, you'll get 20 or 30 brigades of high quality reserves. That's the Israeli model. It's the Estonian model with they're called Territorial Defense Forces. It's the Finnish model, Territorial Defense Forces. Any of those 3 countries' models would work great for Taiwan. I don't tell them which one. I just say you got to pick one. Your current thing isn't working. And I think they recognize this, but it's a really hard challenge, domestic politics-wise and kind of funding-wise and things. But I think they'll get there. But the one country that's going to measure that really well is China. And to me, that has a big deterrent effect. As that reserves becomes 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 skilled reservists, Taiwan, that kind of most dangerous scenario of a cross-state invasion becomes just a little less enjoyable
because there'll be an insurgency when you get there. They'll know
That's
that.
right.
I think we'll leave it there for today. I got to say, I learned a lot from traveling with you guys, enjoyed traveling with you guys, learned a lot from this discussion today. And I'm glad that you were here today, glad that you're doing the work you do, and glad to all of you who are out there listening to this edition of Foreign Policy.